Wanderlei Silva was undoubtedly the scariest man in the history of MMA. He was the man that put Pride on the map, having the most wins, knockouts, and longest winning streak in the history of the company. He later went on to have an equally devastating career in the UFC, and today we'll be taking a look at some of the moments that made Wanderlei Silva the scariest man in the history of the sport. Let's begin. First up, Silva's fight against Sean Bormet in 1997. Wanderlei Silva was an unknown up-and-coming fighter in 1997. He had 2 wins under his belt and was looking to make a bigger name for himself, so he decided to join a Brazilian promotion called IVC, where he took on his first opponent, Sean Bormet. Bormet was far more experienced in the sport than Silva, and most people thought he would win the fight. But against all odds, Silva knocked out Bormet, a former All-American champion, with a devastating kick in just the first round of the fight. He pulled a victory out of nothing against an opponent who was considered one of the best college wrestlers in the NCAA. This fight proved that even if you were a world-renowned wrestler in the MMA ring, you need other skills to back yourself up. Ultimately, Silva became a very well-known name in Brazil and the United States among the MMA community. Of course, it wasn't as big of a sport back then as it is today, but Silva would continue down this path. Up next, his loss to Arturo Mariano in 1997. Few fighters can say that they came out looking even more menacing after being handed a loss, but Wanderlei Silva certainly can. MMA was still in its early stages in 1997. Not a lot of people had seen it or experienced it. Silva versus Mariano was one of the most anticipated fights of the year. It was the first fight to get a lot of hype behind it in Brazil, and at the center of it all was an undefeated fighter named Wanderlei Silva. During the first half of the fight, Silva was actually pretty dominating, with headbutts, bare knuckles, and kicks to a grounded opponent. This fight had everything you needed to introduce someone to MMA. Around midway through the fight, Silva got busted open by a devastating headbutt coming from Mariano, and for most people, this would have been over. But not for Silva. The Brazilian continued to claw his way through the fight, becoming noticeably weaker with each blow, and more determined. Not only that, but even with a massive gash on his forehead, Silva continued to headbutt Mariano, not letting the pain stop him. Ultimately, a doctor had to stop the fight due to the sheer amount of blood loss that Silva suffered, and even though he lost the fight, he won practically everyone's respect. Coming up, his obliteration of Mike Van Arsdale. If you were aware of the existence of MMA in 1998, Mike Van Arsdale is probably a name you've probably heard of. To many, his career trajectory was as if he was going to become the Michael Jordan of MMA. He became one of the most dominating fighters in the IVC, and more recently, he made his debut on a little American promotion called the UFC. You may have heard of it. But in August of 1998, the undefeated MVA was back in the IVC, and his opponent was Wanderlei Silva, an equally dominant fighter, but not undefeated like Arsdale. If MVA was the Michael Jordan of MMA, then Wanderlei Silva was the Toronto Raptors. In short, he was his kryptonite. 4 minutes into the first round of the fight, Silva delivered a devastating punch and kick combo to knock Arsdale out of the fight. The knockout made Silva a household name, and he notably also received recognition from that American promotion we talked about earlier. Months later, he made his UFC debut. Next, his fight against Kazushi Sakuraba. We're fast-forwarding a few years for the next entry on our list. By 2001, Silva had become one of the biggest names in MMA. He had fought in the UFC and the IVC, and he was now part of the biggest MMA promotion on the planet, Pride. This was a Japan-based promotion where Silva had racked up 5 wins, 1 no contest, and 0 losses. He was considered the face of the company, and his next opponent would be one of the greatest Japanese MMA fighters in history, Kazushi Sakuraba. Kazushi Sakuraba was notably the first man to have beaten 4 members of the legendary Gracie family. He had an unstoppable run in Pride, but of course, his run would have to come to an end sooner or later. This was going to be the fight to determine who the greatest fighter in MMA was. And a minute and a half into the fight, Silva told us all exactly who that was with a devastating knee and soccer kick combo that knocked the daylights out of Sakuraba. It was clear that no competition could take on Silva from that moment. Up next, his draw against Mirko Cro Cop at Pride 20. By Pride 20, Wanderlei Silva was undefeated in the promotion. He had 6 consecutive wins and was by far the most dominant fighter in Pride. However, much of his success had come as a light heavyweight. Silva was given the biggest challenge of his life to enter the heavyweight division and fight Mirko Cro Cop, one of the most successful heavyweights in the promotion. Of course, Silva took the challenge, saying he liked to face tough guys. For the first time in his life, Silva was the underdog heading into a fight. Despite that, Silva was unbothered. He barely even blinked when Cop handed him a pounding. He had a massive advantage over Silva. Ultimately, the fight ended in a draw after all 5 rounds. It was a disappointing matchup for both parties, who wanted a result, but in the end, this did nothing to take away Silva's image as a terrifying fighter. Coming up, Silva's tough fight against Quinton Jackson. By 2003, it was rare to see almost anyone in Pride giving Silva a hard time. The Brazilian was so good that no matter what division he was in, he knew he would win. One of his toughest fights was in the finals of the Pride Grand Prix against an American fighter named Quinton Jackson. Jackson was among the most legendary MMA fighters of all time, gaining popularity in Japan and the United States. Despite being in the same weight class, neither Silva nor Jackson had ever faced each other before. That obviously changed in the finals of the Grand Prix, and what happened next was beautiful. Both guys fought as if their entire careers depended on it. They were clearly having a tough time with each other, but outright refused to let the other win. It was one of the most equal matchups in the history of Pride, a promotion famous for its one-sided fights. In the end, though, Silva caught the American with a few devastating knees, knocking him to the ground and winning the Grand Prix. Next, his UFC championship bout against Chuck Liddell. At UFC 79, Wanderlei Silva made his big return to the UFC. Having already proved himself as a pioneer of the sport, Silva was having a downturn in his career with a string of losses against some notable opponents. However, he set his sights on winning the championship in what was now the biggest MMA promotion in the world. His opponent was Chuck Liddell, a man whose career had paralleled Silva but in North America instead. The fight was an instant classic, going for 3 rounds where both men beat the ever-loving crap out of each other. By the end of the fight, you could see that both men hated each other for the beating they had given one another, but at the same time, they had mutual respect for their abilities in the octagon. Ultimately, this ended up being a loss for Silva, but despite that, he had an amazing performance. It was named Fight of the Year by the UFC. And finally, his legendary fight against Cung Le. In 2011, Silva was given the opportunity to redeem himself in the world of MMA as he faced actor and kickboxing legend Cung Le at UFC 139. Despite Lee's domination and showboating during much of the fight, Silva was determined to prove himself. But if there's one thing that you never want to do to Silva, whether he's in his prime or out of it, it's pissing him off. Cung Le learned this the hard way as he got hit by a flurry of punches and kicks that completely decimated him and left his nose shattered. The image of Cung Le's bloody nose still remains etched into UFC fans' heads to this day, and to many, this was the legend's last truly great performance. While he would only go on to have 4 more fights after this, losing all but one, there isn't anyone in the world that can say that Wanderlei Silva wasn't the scariest man in the history of MMA. Whether he wins or loses, he will mess you up for life if you're his opponent. That's a wrap for this video. Do you think anyone comes close to being as scary as Silva? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. We'll see you in the next one.